trainings for social workers all over. She just told me that she did, what was it, 37 presentations in 16 days or something. She speaks to nonprofits like us. She consults and advises on many aspects of the subject of human exploitation, particularly in the arena of sexual exploitation. She also does tech work, helping organizations manage and understand the data they collect. She has worked for the police department in San Francisco, no longer.
I still connect with them. I'll talk
in the victims unit, as a human trafficking analyst. We are incredibly lucky to have Catie Hart with us. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. As you can see, my presentation today is called The Anti-Human Trafficking Movement in the Me Too Era. And there's a reason for the quotes around human trafficking, and I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about myself than Scott did, but really the question that so many of us that do this work are trying to answer is, what are the unintended consequences of the policies that we're making? And kind of this discourse between punitive, right? We live in a society where we try to punish people into behaving versus healing. So we're going to be talking about that. But really, that's been kind of, I've been doing this work in different capacities for 20 years. And that's really the question that I'm working hard with other folks in the Bay to answer at this point. So that's what we're going to be exploring. My name is Catie Hart, and I am a victim survivor of sex trafficking. I'm 38 years old, and I moved to San Francisco when I was 18 from Colorado. I didn't like the snow, so I couldn't wait to get to California. And my goal was to do a year of AmeriCorps and establish a residency. It used to be really easy to do in the 90s, and then start college the following fall. A few months after I arrived in San Francisco, I met this man who told me he was 2 years older than me. He was actually 4 years older than me, and just completely fell in love with him. And for 10 months, he pretended to be my boyfriend, and we traveled, and I just thought that he was amazing. It turns out his plan the entire time was to exploit me through the sex trades. And for 7 years, that's what he did. His main method of mind control and brainwashing was sleep deprivation. The human brain needs sleep in order to be able to process information, make decisions, problem solve, and those kinds of things. So he worked very hard to make sure that I didn't sleep for about 5 years. In 2006, through a series of pretty amazing and beautiful things, I met a woman who took me in, and I was able to escape. Let's see, I then started trauma therapy, and eventually I moved down to Capitola, which is 4 miles south of Santa Cruz, and started community college at the young age of 29. And I did a lot of trauma therapy and healing down there, and then as Scott mentioned, I moved back to the Bay, finished my degree in sociology, and for my last few units of that degree, I took an internship at the Special Victims Unit at the San Francisco Police Department. So I'm sure you all have seen the show, right? SVU, Law and Order, dun dun, right? It's not like that in real life at all. But the funny thing is that the Special Victims Unit is only 5 years old in San Francisco, so we actually named our unit after the show. Little factoid for you. During that summer in 2014, when I graduated college and I was doing this internship, the governor passed a huge body of legislation changing the way that we address these human trafficking cases, and I'll talk about what we mean by that in a moment. And so that's how I slid into this job. Special Victims Unit also looks great on my resume, so that's how I became a trainer, and I've traveled from Los Angeles up to the Oregon border over the past 4 years doing these trainings, better understanding kind of how this piece of legislation went from theory, right, being signed, to practice, and how a lot of things in theory looked good, but again, unintended consequences. I'll be putting my information up on the board again at the end if folks want to stay in touch. So a little bit of housekeeping. I have to say that a trigger warning. We'll be talking about violence, sexual violence, trauma and those kinds of things. So just be aware, and if you start to feel any kind of tightness in your chest or anything like that, like feel free to take a walk. I'm not gonna think that you're rude. You know how to take care of yourself, right? We know that people who have been trauma exposed or are even just sensitive, just saying the word trauma can actually ignite the limbic system, which makes you feel anxiety, stress, and those kinds of things. Gender pronouns, because of the journey my life has taken me on, most of the stories that I have involve a male trafficker and a female victim. That's not 100%. I have also seen cases with female traffickers, and we know that there are many boys being trafficked. Unfortunately, the anti-trafficking movement at this time is really only built to identify cisgender female victims, so females who are born as female and identify as female. Thankfully, there are some folks now that are coming to the forefront to start supporting boys. Trafficker, exploiter, and pimp. So this is one of the reasons why I have the human trafficking in quotes in the title of this presentation. When you think of the word trafficking, right, what do we think of? And call it out. Cars, movement, right? When you're a drug trafficker, you're moving drugs. If you're selling drugs, you're a drug dealer, right? If you're trafficking them, you're bringing them over international or state borders. Well, the anti-trafficking movement is really very new. It's only about 10 years old, which when you look at social justice movements, it's basically in its infancy. And when it began, there weren't really any survivor voices in it because it's really hard to identify as a survivor, right? People can judge you. And they decided they didn't like the word pimp because it's been glamorized by people like Snoop Dogg. So they thought, well, maybe that's one of the reasons why these young girls are ending up being exploited because of rap music and the media. I don't buy that. I think it's much more complex than that. So they decided they didn't want to use that word, so they were going to put it under the umbrella of human trafficking, which just that makes my job so much more difficult because as you'll see, one thing that traffickers or pimps do is they confuse their victims into thinking that this is a relationship. It's an intimate relationship. So when we go to young people and we say, we think you're being trafficked, they look at us like, what are you talking about? Or if you ever see the billboards with hands up like this with chains around them or ropes around them and it says, stop trafficking, that's very harmful messaging because if a young person who is being trafficked but is maybe a little bit confused sees that, they're gonna go, oh, my hands aren't chained. That's not me, right? So this is what I've realized in the past year of this work is that we have to start from the very beginning just dissecting the language that we use, right? The word exploiter or being exploited in this context also bothers me because I did study sociology, which means I did a lot of studying of capitalism, and I'll tell you, capitalism, especially hypercapitalism, is an exploitation model. It doesn't exist without exploitation. So I had a survivor, a young woman who was a mother, come up to me and say, you know, everyone tells me I'm doing so great because I'm not participating in the sex trades anymore, but I'm working at the dollar store and I can't pay my rent, and they're saying that I'm not being exploited anymore. Right? And I kind of had to give that one to her. So when people come up to me and they say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you were exploited, and they say it in a way that they don't understand they're being exploited when they go, you know, to work for some corporation, it's always very interesting to me. So I use these three terms interchangeably. The other thing is CSEC, which is commercial sexual exploitation of children. That might be a term that I throw out here and there, so I just want to make sure folks know what that is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that has its own designation. When I say participation in the sex trades, what I mean is trading anything that's sexual in nature for anything of value. So I was on the phone with a service provider yesterday, and she said that this girl was selling nude photos of herself, and they were worried that she might start participating in the sex trades. And I said, well, she already is, right? Because she's trading something that's sexual in nature for something of value, even if she's not making contact with that person. So webcam shows, those kinds of things also are included in under the umbrella with all the other sex work that we know: strip clubs, escorts, streetwalkers, pornography, anything that's sexual in nature that's traded for anything of value: money, drugs, food, shelter, transportation, a place to stay. That would be considered participation in the sex trades. So human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, and/or coercion in order to exploit another person's labor. So human trafficking is the umbrella that encompasses not just sex trafficking, but folks who are being exploited in agriculture, restaurants, nail salons, on and on. We're seeing it pretty much everywhere these days. But today we're going to be talking about sex trafficking, and oftentimes when we think of trafficking victims, we think of folks who are from another country. Again, this is where the language can make my job confusing for people. We're talking mostly about folks who are born in the United States and who are basically pimped by somebody else today. Does that make sense? All right. There's one caveat. Basically, as the anti-trafficking movement was beginning, we were starting to see that young people under the age of 18, minors, were participating in the sex trades and being arrested. Some of them weren't even at the age of consent, and they were being charged with prostitution. There was a story in Los Angeles where these girls were in a group home. The pimp would come and pick them up at night. The group home staff would unlock the door, let the girls out. They would work all night long. The pimp would return them in the morning, pay the group home staff to let them back in, right? So everybody was making money off these 13 and 14-year-olds, but they were the ones that were ending up arrested constantly. So we realized we needed to change this immediately, but I think the kind of powers that be also realized that we weren't at a time when we were ready to talk about like decriminalization. So the solution that they came up with was to basically say that any person under the age of 18 who's found to be participating in the sex trades, whether or not they're experiencing force, fraud, and coercion, are now considered a victim of human trafficking. So these 4 circles represent 4 people who are participating in the sex trades. The 2 circles underneath are minors. The 2 circles above are adults. The 2 circles on the left are experiencing force, fraud, and coercion. So they have a pimp or a trafficker. The 2 on the right do not have a trafficker. Every purple circle now is considered a victim of human trafficking. So again, for a minor, you don't have to have an identified trafficker. And why would somebody under the age of 18 who's not being forced into the sex trades participate in the sex trades? This is a question I get all the time, right? Because we want to think, oh, those kids, they're dirty, they're broken, they're sluts. But when you really start to put it into context, it's humbling is almost not even a strong enough word. I had a case where a 15-year-old was being chronically molested by her mom's boyfriend. So every night he would crawl into bed with her and molest her. And she realized that if she saw a couple of customers, she could check herself into a hotel room and lock the door and get a good night's sleep. It's a strategy, right? A lot of these youth are strategizing their way through life, and they're strategizing their way through problems that some of us cannot even imagine. So one of the things that I do in my work and that I try to support others in doing is when we identify someone under the age of 18 who's participating in the sex trades, our question needs to be, what problem are they trying to solve? And why is participating in the sex trades the perceived solution? And then we can start to hopefully support that youth in being safer, I guess would be the word. Oftentimes I'll hear adults say things to me like, well, she said she likes it. And I say, well, let's talk about that. Like, she probably does like the problem that she's solving, but if you said to her, if you could have this problem solved, or if you could have those safe nights at home without having to have sex with strangers, those kids would take that any day of the week, right? So again, they're solving problems. The green circle up there is considered a consensual sex worker, and they are in violation of the law. They can be arrested and charged. An interesting caveat, just an interesting system that I want to point out, and again, this kind of wraps back to the Me Too era and how we're really starting to dissect and look at things a little bit differently. So 647B is the penal code that you're charged with if you're caught selling sex. But it's also the penal code that you're charged with if you're caught buying sex, okay? Obviously, usually they set the stings up so that it's women who are arrested for selling sex, men who are arrested for buying sex. For the women, that stays on your record for the most part. We're changing that, but especially 5-10 years ago, that stays on your record. It can stop you from getting general assistance, cash aid, grants for school, all the things that you might need, right, when you want to change your life. If you're caught buying sex, again, same exact penal code, you are offered a chance to go to John's school, which is just like traffic school, where you go and you sit for 8 hours and you listen to presentations and you pay $500 and then it gets expunged off your record. So I went and sat in on this one day, and it's like all these dudes sitting in the room like this all day long, and then right at 5 o'clock, they're like, where do I sign? Where do I sign? My wife doesn't know. Like, take my money. I've sat through this. Imagine if we offered that to women who are arrested for selling sex. An 8-hour day where we could tell them, here's services. Here's where you go if you get in trouble. Here's an advocate if you need it. Like, when you're ready to change your life, here's the phone numbers that you call, right? Instead, it's a very different consequence for the exact same penal code. So these are the systems that we're working really hard to change. So when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, one of the things that I forgot to mention that I did at the Special Victims Unit was I listened to jailhouse phone calls. So when an alleged trafficker was arrested, obviously any call that you make from jail or prison is recorded, and I would listen to those calls. I would listen to these folks run their girls from jail and talk to their family members, and I was absolutely stunned at how their strategies all seem to be exactly the same. Like, there might be a little bit of a different spin, but like their personality profile, it was like textbook, all the same, and they all sounded the same as my pimp or trafficker had 13 years earlier. And that's when I started to realize, like, we need to really start studying and understanding traffickers better, right? Because one of the things that we do, and it's the same with domestic violence, is that we basically say, we're gonna teach all the women and girls to be smart enough, strong enough, and love themselves enough not to be in those relationships. And the underlying messaging there is that it's up to us, and that if we're all smart enough and strong enough, domestic violence and trafficking are just gonna magically go away. That's like, if every single person in a domestic violence relationship got up and left their abuser today, would domestic violence be over? Absolutely not. If anything, it would just be opening the doors for like a whole new round of victims, right? No little boy ever says, I wanna grow up and beat my wife, or I wanna grow up and torture people to make money, right? Something happens there. So that's, listening to those jailhouse phone calls is where my passion for better understanding the perpetrator came to be, and I'll be talking about it more throughout the presentation, but I've actually done an immense amount of work and partnered with someone who works in San Francisco jails teaching a curriculum to help men unlearn their violence. The idea being that violence is learned, it is a learned behavior, and we'll talk more about the kind of psychological profile of the trafficker in a moment. So, going back to force, fraud, and coercion, especially 5 years ago, 4 years ago when I started this work, folks for the most part thought that human trafficking was being kidnapped off the street and held captive somewhere and forced to have sex with strangers. Those are the stories that make it to the news, right? They're sensational, they're easy, they're quick, they get eyeballs there. And they're, like I said, they're easier to digest, right? The idea that someone can be psychologically manipulated in this way is absolutely terrifying to us as human beings. So we're talking about force, fraud, and coercion, but we're gonna start by talking about fraud, which is how 99.9% of these cases begin. And in my 20 years of experience, they almost always begin with a fraudulent romantic interest. So my trafficker, right, was driving around, looping around, looping around, looping around, looking for someone that he thought looked young and kind of vulnerable or out of sorts, which was perfect because I'm sure I fit that bill. I had just gotten to San Francisco. Like, I didn't really know anyone. I was in this big city. And again, he was presenting as someone who was interested in having a relationship with me. And one of the red flags that I teach young people is if somebody is in this category where they're trying to figure out if they can take advantage of you. Basically, those first few weeks and conversations that I was having with my trafficker, I was actually being interviewed, and I had no idea. I thought that he must really like me and care about me because he listens so intently, and he asks these questions. He must really be interested in me, right? If anybody ever asks you in the first couple days, couple weeks of hanging out, if you've ever been molested, abused, neglected, that is a huge red flag. Right, that's something that you talk about as you get to know each other. It happens organically, you build trust, right? I always tell people, like, I'm 38 years old and I'm single, and if I were on a second date and some guy was like, hey, were you ever raped as a child? I would be like, wait, what? Like, that's not normal. But traffickers want to know. The other thing that they do during this fraudulent period is they move really hard and really fast. Within a couple of weeks, they're talking about you're the one for them, you're their soulmate, they want to marry you, they want to have kids, they're selling you all these dreams, especially if they've gotten that information from you that that's kind of what you want to do, is you want to, you know, have a family after college or whatever. So the fraudulent period is, again, oftentimes, it's more like an interview. Traffickers like someone who has unresolved trauma in their past because it helps to, it makes it easier to create and maintain a trauma bond, which we'll talk about that in a moment. We've also seen traffickers present not as boyfriends, but as like modeling agents. We're seeing that a lot in Santa Cruz of all places. I'm not sure why. You know, oh, I'm gonna make you a star, here's a plane ticket, or, you know, come over and let me take photos of you, and that's kind of how they start to rope the youth in. But for the most part, as I said, it's a fraudulent romantic interest. Coercion, so again, we're talking about force, fraud, and coercion. Coercion presents itself in many, 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 many different ways. Traffickers are brilliant at coercion. Coercion can be as direct as, I'm gonna kill you if you leave me. I'm gonna kill you if you don't do what I say. I'm gonna beat you if you don't do what I say. My trafficker, almost every day, would very calmly and creepily tell me the ways that he would have me killed and who he would hire if I ever left. Because he had already isolated me and manipulated so much of my psyche, I truly believed that. Like when we ask with domestic violence, why did she stay? Why did she stay? Like, it would just be so much easier if she would just leave, right? The truth of the matter is that 75% of women who are murdered by their domestic abuser are murdered while they're trying to escape. So when we ask, why did she stay? Oftentimes the answer to that question is because she didn't want to die. Coercion can be much more complex. Coercion can be, I had a case where this guy, he was trafficking, pimping this girl, and he could tell that she was starting to kind of pull away. And so he figured out where her little sister went to school, and he went and took pictures of her leaving class, and he said, look, I know where your sister is going to school. So finally the victim says, I'm leaving, I don't want to be here anymore. And he says, look, I know where your sister goes to school, and if you don't do what I say, she's next. Boom, right there. That young person thought that she was protecting her sister, right? That's coercion. It's putting you in a place where you feel like you're protecting something much bigger than yourself. And again, we're going to talk about isolation in a minute. Isolation is a huge part of this. Human beings, we kind of need a sounding board, right? Especially when these things are happening. So I'm trying to think of other examples of coercion. Coercion could be a trafficker who sometimes their strategy is to hang out where runaways are and find someone and say, oh, you look cold, hungry, you know, do you want a place to stay? Do you want some food? Obviously that person's in a very vulnerable place. They're trying to survive. The trafficker brings them to a hotel, puts them up for a couple of nights, starts the flirting, and then says, oh baby, you know what? Like, I just spent all of my money trying to take care of you, and now I need you to contribute. I don't know what else to do. Like, I've done all this for you, and I'm so sorry. I love you so much. I wish this wasn't true, but like the only way that I know that you can make money is by doing this, and I'm so sorry. I love you. But you can imagine if someone is really young, they do feel like indebted. They do feel like they owe this person who just kind of saved them, right? So those are some examples of coercion. Again, there's the list could go on and on and on. These folks are very good at what they do, and they really create coercive strategies based on the personality of the person that they're trafficking. So isolation, so we're talking again about force, fraud, and coercion, but I include two other things that I feel like we can't understand this issue without. Isolation is one of them. I argue that it is impossible to traffic someone for a long period of time or abuse someone for a long period of time without isolating them. One of the ways that traffickers do this, they move around. I work with a survivor in Santa Cruz who within, I think, like 9 months had been to every single state. And that was just his strategy. He's moving these people constantly so that they're not getting grounded. They're not meeting people who could be supportive. Smartphones and cell phones, like how many of you know your best friend's phone number by heart? Right? In the 90s, like I still know my high school boyfriend's phone number because we had to dial, you know? If you get separated from your smartphone and you don't have access to the internet, you can be really, really isolated. And I've heard the story so many times that I'm like, oh, there's definitely something there. Or I ask a youth, what happened to your phone? Oh, my boyfriend broke it, lost it. Borrowed it, and somehow all the contacts got erased. Like when I was starting to get away from my trafficker in 2005, that was the day of the flip phone. And like whenever he sensed that something wasn't right, he would crack my phone in half before he left. People aren't memorizing phone numbers, right? So one of the pieces of harm reduction I do with my high schoolers, and I encourage you all to do the same, memorize a couple phone numbers. Because the other thing too is that for folks who do find themselves in a situation like this, right? Adults can be so simplistic. Oh, well, if you're in this situation, just ask for help, you know, call the police. And what we're asking young people to do is call the police and say, I've been participating in the sex trades without a gun to my head. Like, that's a lot for 15, 16. That was a lot for me at 26. On top of that, police can arrest you for that, for just participating in the sex trades. Do you know that San Francisco is the first in the nation to pass a prioritizing sex worker safety policy? It just passed in December, where now if you are participating in the sex trades and you get beaten, raped, robbed, you can go to the San Francisco Police Department and they're not allowed to arrest you. We're the first in the nation, okay? So when we're simplifying things by saying, well, you know, you just ask for help, 911 is usually not the number that these folks are gonna call. So it's always really good to have a couple of phone numbers memorized. And I should take my own advice because I almost know my best friend's number. And plus, youth who find themselves in the sex trades, like that's isolating just as it is. It's very ostracizing, right? That's another method of coercion also, is that once the trafficker has gotten their victim into a place where they've already participated in the sex trades, that's like the ultimate lever of coercion. Like, if you don't do what I say, I'm gonna tell everyone that you're a whore. If you don't do what I say, like I'm gonna call CPS and you're gonna have your kids removed because you're a prostitute, right? Those kinds of the slut shaming can be really powerful because it is kind of the most stigmatized identity that women especially can have, right? Being a slut, whore, prostitute. So force is again, force, fraud, and coercion is what we're talking about. We all know what force is. It's violence. Oftentimes, if someone is violent with you, they don't need to be violent with you again. The threat is enough because the brain, the pathways that are created by trauma are much stronger because of their survival, right? And our brains want to survive. So oftentimes people think like, oh, well, you know, there used to be these lists going around a few years ago. I haven't seen them as much anymore, thank goodness. And they're like, how to identify a sex trafficking victim? Like, look for bruises. And I'm like, you're so underestimating how smart a pimp is, because a pimp does not want their victim to be covered in bruises, right? They're gonna make less money. So they either figure out strategies to abuse you without leaving marks, or again, just the threat can be enough. But what I argue is that the use of violence and force, really, its main reason is to create and maintain a trauma bond. So, let's see, what's my next slide? Do I have it in the right order? No. We're gonna go back to that slide in a second, sorry. Trauma bonding is the most bizarre, counterintuitive, strange thing, and I've lived through it, and I still, when I work with someone who's trauma bonded to another person, I just sometimes just wanna shake them. Like, I don't know if you guys are old enough to have these experiences yet, but you will eventually, where like you have a friend or someone, a family member, who is in a relationship that everyone knows isn't that healthy, and like every once in a while she'll have a breakdown and call you and tell you these horrible stories, and oh, she's in so much pain, she's ready to leave him, and then she goes back the next day. And it's so confusing. And then eventually, oftentimes, as that person's friends, we can get to the point where we're like, well, she's just stupid. We can't deal with this anymore. And right there, we've just empowered the abuser by isolating further, right? So one thing that I definitely recommend is that if you do find yourself in the situation where you're supporting someone who's trauma bonded, like just be willing to be there for them, knowing that the friendship will not be reciprocal for a time, right? Don't desert that person. So this is the best way that I've found to explain trauma bonding, because again, it is freaking bizarre. But what I've found is that it's basically a misfire in the brain. So human beings are pack animals. We need each other, and therefore the primal part of our brain is wired to bond with each other, right? Like our babies, when they're born, they're so helpless. They need to bond with a primary caretaker in order to survive. That's one of the first things that we look for when a baby is born, is that they're starting to make eye contact in the first few weeks. And when they're starting to make eye contact, that's when we know they're bonding, right? It's a really good sign. If I were up in the mountains in the winter trying to survive by myself, and I had to grow my own food, make my own shelter, make my own clothes, my chances of survival are a lot lower than if I have a community of people where someone's doing the food and someone's doing the shelter, right? We're pack animals. Our brains are constantly bonding with other human beings. Even in this situation, I call this like bonding light, right? Like it's just what our brain does involuntarily. If you have a best friend that you're hanging out with all the time, you're gonna bond with them even more. If you share meals with someone, you're gonna bond even more. If you're intimate with someone, you're gonna bond even more. If you travel with someone, especially to a foreign country or on a road trip, you're exploring the world, right? You're bonding even more. Now, if you and I are walking down the street today and we get held up at gunpoint and we're terrified and we survive, we will never forget each other, right? We could run into each other a year later and we'd probably give each other a hug and say, oh my gosh, how are you? It would be very different, right, than just going about our lives as we would today. We probably wouldn't even recognize each other a year from now, right? When you survive something scary and dangerous, our brains bond much more securely to that person that you survived that with, right? If I'm walking down the street today and someone jumps out of the bushes that I don't know and attacks me, and I see their face, and I run into them 2 weeks later, my brain has filed that in run, like danger, run, get away, right? But if I'm intimate with somebody and they're caring and loving and everything is good, and then they're violent with me, and then they're caring and nice again, my brain gets confused about where to file that. And instead of filing it with run, this person is bad, it files it with we just survived something scary together. It strengthens the bond. And this is the kind of bond that is so strong and so deep. It's hard to explain. It's like this pull, like you don't feel okay unless you're next to that person. You'll see that when your friends become mothers, you know, they're home for the first however many weeks with their baby, like even the first errand that they run without their baby, they're just like, I need to get home to my baby, I need to get home to my baby, right? It's this pull towards this person. That's how strong a trauma bond feels. The way to reverse and start to heal a trauma bond is by no contact with the person that you're trauma bonded to. Sometimes even just 48 hours can start to reverse a trauma bond. For me, my trafficker or pimp broke his leg really, really bad in 2005 and was in the hospital, and I got 2 weeks of like reprieve, and I'm pretty sure that's when my trauma bond started to heal. Now, it still took me 13 months to actually make my escape, but there was like a lot of planning that needed to be done and those kinds of things. So trauma bonding, again, super, super fascinating, super real. And anytime someone is doing something illogical, like, why do they keep going back to that person? Or why are they defending that person who just abused them? I instantly think, oh, trauma bonding. And it helps me to work with that person from that perspective, rather from the like, don't you get it? Because the brain is misfiring, right? So they don't necessarily get it yet. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I think this was a little bit out of order, but I'm sure you guys will forgive me, are boundaries. So this is why this is out of order, because I should have talked about boundaries during the fraudulent part. So we never talk about boundaries to young people. I feel like adults have just really missed the mark. It's such a disappointment. Like the fact that I didn't start talking about boundaries until I was 35 years old in therapy is just a shame. Shame on us adults. Traffickers, when they're trying to see if there's someone if you're someone that they might want to take advantage of, they're gonna do these things where they push your boundaries or push you into places that make you feel uncomfortable, and then watch and see how you react. Do you set a boundary or not? And it can start out as easy as you had plans at 5 o'clock and they show up at 6. Do you tell them I'm sorry, I have a 15-minute rule, you're 60 minutes late, call me next time? Or do you just kind of sit there with that discomfort and you're just happy that they showed up? Or will they say something they'll say something to you that's lightweight rude, or that they know is gonna make you feel uncomfortable, and then they're studying your reaction to see if A, you feel uncomfortable, and B, if you're gonna do anything about it. So another thing to remember is, I think it's really, really important to explore boundaries and what your boundaries mean to you. And boundaries don't just have to be, we're not just talking about in intimate relationships, right? Just boundaries in general, and we all need to think about what our personal boundaries are. If I'm in line at the grocery store and someone, those close standers, I'm you're gonna get there at the same amount of time, just give me some space, right? That's a physical boundary. A friend of mine tried to call me on FaceTime the other day, and I was I don't do FaceTime, no, and I just set that boundary. And some of those are just to practice setting boundaries, because we're not talking about those things. And if we don't know how to set boundaries, we're much, much more vulnerable. In terms of the traffickers, what I have learned, and I've actually, like I said, I've partnered with this man who actually was a pimp in the 80s and 90s. He went and served some time in prison, and he now works with men who are incarcerated for violence. It took me a really, really long time to trust him, and a really long time to believe that he was actually reformed and that he had done the work. A couple of years, actually. I'll never forget the first time I was in the car with him. I had this moment where I was what have I done? He's gonna look at me and be you know what this is, let's go, He's a totally gentle, sweet soul. But the more research that I do with him and other people, what we've noticed, what we know is that, first of all, unless you have a severe something, part of your brain missing where you can't you don't have a conscience, right? People who grow up to be violent have unresolved trauma. You can pretty much assume that to be true. Of course, not every single person who's traumatized grows up to be violent, right? But when I study these folks, this is what I see. They have they always have some kind of abuse or neglect in their history. Oftentimes it's sexual abuse. And especially if that young man or young boy is sensitive, then they start school, right, where there's this hyper masculinity imposed on our boys, where just lost my train of thought, where they learn that the only emotion that's safe to express is anger, right? Because if we see a boy crying or being nurturing or any of those other emotions, they're called the sissy or whatever, right? So they learn that that's not safe. So then they start practicing this anger, and they realize how much power it has, and they associate that power with safety, because when they were abused, the person who was abusing them had the ultimate power. Does that make sense, how that cycle can kind of start? That's kind of the beginning of where we see these folks on their journey then ending up later on in life being abusers. It was great. I was just looking at the curriculum that we're using in the jails, and it says, violence is learned, so is intimacy. And so the work that I'm doing right now is really that we all need to heal together. boys, girls, men, women, like we all deserve healing. The way that I look at these stories of like trafficking or domestic violence abuse is that more often than not, it's two really traumatized people coming together and going on this really dark journey together. And again, with all the curriculums and everything that I've studied that show that really teach that we just need to teach our girls to be smart enough and strong enough that trafficking is magically going to go away. People come up to me all the time and they say, but you seem so strong. You seem so smart. Like they can't reconcile that I was in that kind of situation because I seem so smart and so strong. When that's just an assumption that people that are stupid get caught up into these relationships. And I'll give you an example of that. I was listening to a segment on NPR, and they were talking about an anti-trafficking curriculum that they were doing with, I think, high school girls. And this girl raised her hand, and she said, you know, I was on Facebook, and this guy was messaging me that I didn't know, and I just felt weird about it, and so I blocked him, and I shut it down. And the teacher's response was, well, see, if you hadn't been so smart, you could have been pulled into something really dangerous. So what is she saying right there? She's saying that if you do get pulled into something dangerous, you're not smart, right? So from the very, very early age, we're teaching young people that this is something that you're smarter than, so that by the time they get to a point where maybe they're experiencing abuse, they feel like they're stupid. So now, not only do they have to raise their hand and say, I've been trading sex without a gun to my head, they also have to say, and it's because I'm stupid, right? Which that has, again, that's not what we're talking about here. When we're talking about self-love, like if we just teach our girls to love themselves enough, right? And I was thinking about this the other day, and thinking about how sometimes when we see someone who's just kind of standing like this, or, you know, like this, we think, oh, they're not confident, right? They don't like themselves. They don't love themselves enough. Why we make that assumption, I'm not sure, right? Because we don't know what happened to that person in the past 24 hours. We don't know what's going on in that person's life. And it was really funny because I noticed that when I'm in a place where suddenly I feel kind of like maybe not safe, like maybe I'm in a neighborhood that doesn't feel super safe, I always like adjust my shoulders up, right? And that's just something that I do. But I was tripping off how like as women, like even as our bodies change, sometimes it's really hard for us to do that because then people think that we're trying to like show off our breasts. And that can be unsafe, right? So there's all these things that we're kind of internalizing as we're going through life. And that can be perceived as vulnerability. And I'm gonna end just by talking quickly about vulnerability. Because again, traffickers are looking for folks who are vulnerable for all these reasons, right? Homelessness or unresolved trauma and these kinds of things. But I realized I oftentimes am using a different definition of vulnerability than my audience is. And almost always, when you hear the word vulnerable, just call it out. What do you think? Weak. What else? Scared, weak, and those kinds of things, right? We conflate the two. So there's two different sides of vulnerability. And I'll say that, by the way, you're not gonna make it through life without being vulnerable. Like, it's a part of the human experience. And part of vulnerability is so beautiful, right? If my best friend called me today and was like, F you, I'm never talking to you again, I would be crushed. Because I'm opening myself up to her because I love her, right? And so I'm vulnerable to her. But that's a beautiful part of vulnerability. And that's actually very strong when someone's willing to do that, right? The kinds of vulnerabilities that we're talking about here, when we think about weakness or things like that, almost always the youth that we work with, their vulnerabilities are coming from outside of them. And what I mean by that is they're experiencing community violence. They're experiencing abuse. They are experiencing hunger. Like if a newborn baby is born into a family that doesn't have enough money to feed that baby, that makes that baby vulnerable, right? But do we look at that baby and say, well, that was dumb for being born into that family? Like, you're super weak, right? These things are things that happen outside of us. So I think it's also really important that we examine our vulnerabilities, and I guess it can be really hard to do in the moment. It's really easy for me to say as a 38-year-old, but if you are ever starting to feel these red flags in a relationship and you look back and you think like, wow, I was in a really vulnerable place when I met this person. That is something to definitely take note of. So again, when we're talking about the anti-trafficking movement, I hope that I've made my argument here today that we're really talking about things on the spectrum of healthy and unhealthy relationships. And I think that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you so much. Oh, is that clock? Does anybody have a question? Yeah.
Just saw the show called Deuce on HBO.
Uh-huh.
And I was curious if you had seen it or if you read about it, how you feel like it portrays trafficking. It's set in the 70s, so
Right.
lingo trafficking.
Right. I personally love the show, and it's really interesting because, I have social workers that'll be like, that's just so terrible, right? But we have to remember hegemony. Like, I need music that's talking about pimps and hoes sometimes because they're telling my story. You know what I mean? Like, that's just the truth. Like, so I personally really like the show. I think they've done a great job with it. The pimp culture has evolved a lot since the 70s, for sure. But I enjoy it.
Can we settle down, please? Sorry.
One more question? Sorry, that was my fault.
No.
Yeah. So my process was really, really long. Like I said, I think my trauma bond started to reverse kind of or heal when he broke his leg. And this woman that I met very randomly one day told me that I could sleep on her couch for a couple of nights in an emergency, and like I just kind of made a run for it one day. Like my gut was just like now, and I showed up on her doorstep and didn't leave for a year and a half. She was like in her 50s and had raised her children and stuff. The main process really is trauma therapy and kind of trauma literacy, even more importantly, and understanding the human brain and how it relates to trauma. If a gazelle runs away from a cheetah, if a cheetah is chasing a gazelle and the gazelle thinks it's gonna die, but it survives, it has a mechanism in its brain where it gets away, right? It survives. It's forced to go to a shady place and give itself a seizure, and all the trauma shakes out of its body and brain. We don't have that. So trauma, our brains really flourish when we're experiencing love, safety, connection, joy, right? That's what we're built for. So trauma therapy and trauma literacy have completely changed my life. Yeah, I think those are the things that I would say.
Another question?
Yeah.
I was actually curious, like, was there a specific event or like time where you realized like it wasn't a relationship and it was something more than you thought it was? Like, was it a specific day or was it like gradual, like, and you kind of realized like what it had become?
It was kind of a mismatch of everything. Like, it was almost day to day, minute to minute. But even during the times for the most part when I was like, oh, he's pimping me, it was also like, but this is just for a little while. Like, soon I'm gonna retire and, we're gonna be together. So it was, I'll never forget this woman. Her pimp married her to get her out of her house because she was living in Australia. She was Greek Catholic, and women can't leave their homes unless they're married. And brought her to San Francisco, and I'll never forget one day she looked at me and she goes, do you think that I have a pimp or a husband? And to me it was so obvious. I was like, a pimp, obviously. But I still thought I had a boyfriend. The mind is incredible that way.
Is there a final question? So I know from having gotten to know Catie and seeing the roundtable last time, she's very open and honoring of your questions. I know there are many. I hope to see as many of you as we can at the roundtable. Can we say a big thank you again to Catie Hart?